A very good morning to you, members of the media, members of the cabinet, members of staff. I want to thank members of the media for coming here at such short notice. This press conference was not planned because normally we have our press conference after cabinet on a Thursday. But we thought it important enough to speak to the population this morning on what happened in the Parliament this morning. You would have heard the Attorney General put on record, for the benefit of the media and the national population who will depend on the media for this broadcast, how the business of Trinidad and Tobago was gutted and undermined this morning in the Parliament. It's a simple, straightforward matter. We in Trinidad and Tobago, we have a scourge of gang activity in many, if not most, of our communities. There are thousands of families and tens of districts where the quality of life is being severely impacted by illegal gang activity. What this bill was meant to do was to enact into law to make illegal the behavior of the organizing of criminal enterprises as gangs. And for some inexplicable reason, our colleagues in the Parliament found it difficult or impossible to convert the scourge of gang activity into an illegal activity in this country. As a matter of fact, even as we were in the process of attempting to create this law last night, news came to us of the robbery at Piarco Airport done by a number of persons, which we suspect might be a gang of some kind, because the law says 2 or more persons acting in concert qualifies as a definition of a gang. Even as the Parliament was seeking to make illegal those conspiracies and those enterprises, that and all could not assist us in impacting upon our friends. We can do many things in this country and ought to do many things as the government. The one thing that we cannot do and cannot hold out to the country is to make the opposition vote in any way or fashion. How the 18 members of the UNC-COP vote is entirely within their control. There's absolutely nothing the government can do other than to make the case for support for a piece of legislation. And I dare say, I have been in the Parliament since 1986. I've been in Parliament. I've been there with the Robinson government. I've been there with the Manning government. I've been there with the Pandey government, and I've been there with the Bisesa Prasad government. Yesterday, I have never seen a case more convincingly made for a piece of legislation. And I tell you too, the piece of legislation was not required by John or Harry or Tom. It was required by every single citizen in Trinidad and Tobago, because the gang activity in Trinidad and Tobago threatens the life, the well-being, the wherewithal of the economy of all of us, and our livelihood, and our very life. That piece of legislation impacted on every one of us. And the case was made. Today, I want to congratulate the Attorney General for one of the best presentations I've ever seen in the Parliament when he made the case for this. Let me draw your attention to our way to the Parliament. Before we got to the Parliament, the opposition was indicating through the media that they didn't intend to support the legislation. But that is not unusual. When you get to the Parliament, we would expect to make a convincing case. But let me go back a bit further. In July of this year, knowing what we were working on, knowing what we were experiencing with the gangs, knowing that we had to come back to Parliament, and knowing that we would want to make gang activity illegal in this country, I sought the presence of the opposition leader. We attended upon each other in the Parliament building, and among the issues we discussed was how we should go forward to create this law, which was in abeyance since they voted against it or voted not to support its continuation at an earlier time. I got instructions from the opposition leader then as to how to communicate with her side, and we did so. When the bill was voted down for its continuation into law last time, they raised two specific objections. One was that there was not enough data as to whether this law was required or not. I don't know where they live, but they wanted data, not experiences from their constituents or from the newspaper and whatever else. They wanted scientific data to justify whether we should reenact this provision into law. And also, there was something else they wanted. It was the units in the police service. We agreed to, and we told them that we will present to them a response to all of these because there were responses and their objections were dealt with. We came to the parliament, and it's now history that after we gave them everything they needed, including addressing up front their recent objections, where they were saying that they would want the bill to go to a joint select committee. That was what was being said on the way to the parliament. They wanted the bill to go to a joint select committee so that they could treat with the matter in committee. That was the first hurdle. But when the Attorney General and the member for St. Joseph comprehensively pointed out that, listen, everything that you are raising here and about requiring a joint select committee have already been to a joint select committee in the parliament. And these matters have been dealt with, and the minutes and the positions of those meetings are here and were read into yesterday's debate. Even the UNC opposition could go no further on that score. They had to drop the idea of using the demand for a joint select committee as a reason for not voting for the bill. And it fell to us now to find out what other reasons would they possibly have. And as we went through the day, the reasons came out. And when we came towards the end of the debate, I did something which I don't normally do. As a matter of fact, it's the first time I've done it as Prime Minister. I did not leave it up to the leader of government business to communicate with the opposition. I intervened myself, way down towards the end of the debate, before I spoke. I called the opposition chief whip behind the speaker's chair, and I asked Mr. David Lee, what are the impediments standing in the way of your team that would cause you not to support this legislation? He said there are two impediments. I said, what are they? He said, one, the law must not apply to the crime of sedition. Because in the debate, they argued that sedition is so broad that the law could be used to abuse people in the political and the labor movement and so on, who are talking things and can find themselves prosecuted for talking things that are criminal. So they want sedition taken out of the treatment. So among the things that the Anti-Gang Act should not deal with is sedition. I said, okay. I said, what else? He said, we want a sunset clause. Because you must remember, when the UNC brought this legislation to the parliament, a sunset clause meaning that the law will remain in force for a specific period of time, and at the end of that time, the law will cease to be in force unless the parliament intervenes and extends it. When the parliament sought to intervene to extend this law when it was under the UNC as a law in the country, the UNC found itself in the opposition and did not vote for an extension. So he said, in this bill that you are putting into law now, we want a sunset clause. I said, that it? He said, yes, okay. I said, okay, done. I had not even said that to my people. From behind the speaker's chair, I came to my seat, and I spoke to the leader of government business, and I spoke to the Attorney General, and I said, we will offer, by way of amendment, the removal of obstacle number 1, the sedition as an offense, and we will return the sunset clause. We then went down clause by clause, as you would have heard. And of course, these impediments were removed along the way. And there was never a negative vote when each clause was put to vote. The last contention we had was the question of the order. Because in the bill, to extend it in the future, at the end of the sunset clause, you had to come to the Parliament. And we were saying by the schedule was saying by affirmative resolution, meaning that you have to put it to the vote in the Parliament and it must be voted into majority for it to continue. They said they didn't want that. And they wanted that out of the bill. To prevent there being any obstacle in their way, we removed that from the bill. And of course, a new argument arose. The length of the life of the sunset clause. How long should the bill remain in force before it expires? How long should you give the police this power to fight gangs? Well, the law, as it lived before, had 5 years under their tenure. It expired in the first year of our tenure. So when we said, when I agreed with the chief whip, to give the sunset clause, we said the same 5 years. Lo and behold, the opposition said, no. We only want to give the police this power for 18 months. Now, ladies and gentlemen, those of you who live in Trinidad and Tobago, those of you who are experiencing the level of all-pervasive and entrenched criminality by the gangs in the East-West corridor, in Central Trinidad, in South Trinidad, and I dare say now in Tobago, do you really think that the police can, even with this law and with the best will in the world, that the police can eradicate this scourge in 18 months? This is nothing new. We are not experiencing anything new here. The Americans experienced it for decades in California, in New York. Central America, virtually the whole country is being run in El Salvador, Honduras by gangs. Gangs don't just evaporate because you pass a law. And I was very surprised. But at that time, I realized that the opposition was hell-bent on not making gang activity in Trinidad and Tobago an illegal act, to allow the police and the services of the security of Trinidad and Tobago to act against persons who have chosen crime, criminality, and gang enterprise as their way of life. And that is when I knew that in Trinidad and Tobago, we have one hell of a problem, because the opposition has decided to come down on the side of support of criminality in Trinidad and Tobago. They wanted to limit the police to 18 months to have this power, a power that is protecting life and limb in Trinidad and Tobago. So we argued, why 18 months? Why not 5 years? They said, okay, 2 years. We continued to discuss. It was, as a matter of fact, it was the longest period of discussion on a clause. At that stage, I entered the discussion again because it was being discussed largely among the lawyers in both teams. I entered this debate, and I indicated that we have to give the police the time to make the law work, to convert information into evidence, to penetrate the gangs. And one of the strategies of penetrating gangs is to put people into the gangs, to provide information to the police, and to manage those moles in there. How many of you ever read or seen the movies? Because the police has a uniform on doesn't mean they can handle a gang. You got to get information. It's an absence of evidence which caused the Anti-Gang Act to fail in 2011, because the then government tried to use it after 8 days of its existence. Clearly, there was no evidence collected during that period. But now we had learned from that. And The police would need the time to build the cases against the individuals who are recruiting people into gangs, who are operating gangs, who are planning and executing raids, who are arming themselves by importing high-powered rifles and so on. The police needs time to build that case. And when you go to court accusing any such person, you have to have a solid body of evidence. What I want to ask the UNC today, and I want every mother in every community that has a son or a daughter on the street, I want to ask every pastor, pundit, or imam in this country to ask the UNC, what is it about making those activities illegal that so offends the UNC that they refuse to vote it into law to allow the law enforcement to take action against those persons? What is it that was so offensive in that law, that proposal for law, that would have made it more difficult for a person who arms him or herself and shoots at a soldier, a customs officer, a policeman, or any person in the security services, meaning to hurt them so as to prevent the state from protecting citizens? What is it in that bill last night that was so offensive, more than these acts of the criminals, that caused the UNC to not vote to make gang activity and criminal enterprises as gangs illegal in Trinidad and Tobago? Okay, we offered the sunset clause of 4 years, and they did not object. When that was put to the vote, it was passed without a dissenting voice. And at the end of it all, what surprised the leader of the opposition was that there was not a single impediment standing in the way of voting for the bill. Because every objection they raised, we gave in. We gave in on the sedition. We gave in on the sunset clause. We gave in on the affirmative action. Every single thing they raised, including the chief whip saying to me as prime minister behind the speaker's chair that there are two obstacles in the way. And I conceded that those two obstacles which they have identified will be removed. So people of Trinidad and Tobago, what we saw this morning, and I want you to take the date. What's today's date? On the 7th of December, 2017, in the wee hours of the morning, parliamentarians in Trinidad and Tobago refused to use their vote to save lives and protect communities in Trinidad and Tobago. Mrs. Kamla Prasad Bisesa and her UNC gang and cabal voted to maintain the status quo, where those who are recruiting young people, sometimes in the schools in our country, arming them with guns, taking them off their mother's breasts, putting them in the street to kill innocent citizens, voted to maintain that status quo for one reason, and one reason alone. And that is so that crime and criminality can remain intractable and a chronic state of affairs in Trinidad and Tobago. So as the murders continue, those politicians in that group could point to the crime and the criminality and the number of murders and so on, and call Trinidad and Tobago a failed state, and hope that you, the voters, will be disgusted with those in office and that you will put them in office. That is what happened in Trinidad and Tobago this morning. And that is the most cynical, wicked, and pernicious act ever inflicted on a people in any part of the Commonwealth. We can do some things in this country as government, as a political party, but we can do nothing about that. That's a matter for you, the people of Trinidad and Tobago. You put them in office, and you got to get them to act for you, because right now they're acting for themselves. I could not believe that I will tell my grandchildren that I served in a parliament, I served during a period in this country with people who would do something like that. Look at the callous, insensitive behavior of the criminal element in this country. Old people The gangs have no respect for the elderly. They treat them in the most disgusting manner, including invading their homes and putting them out, taking away their pension. Young people being raped and killed. And of course, if you're handling commerce in this country and it has any prospect of contributing money to the gang empire, your life is in grave danger. And to think that we have parliamentarians in this country who, after every clause was agreed to, when every objection was consented to, and at the end, when the vote was called to pass that bill into law, they could find no reason except a reason known only to themselves: the politics of crime, maintaining the high level of criminal conduct. Because they know, they're not strangers. They were in the government, and they know that if the police has this power, some of those gang members would not get involved in gang activity because it's now a crime to do so, and you can be held for the crime of being involved in gang activity. Many young people who are now recruited by the gang leaders will know that they should stay away from that because that is a crime that would lead them straight to jail for being a gang member. Without shooting anybody, without killing anybody, without harming anybody, just by being known to be a member of the gang, by however way you identified. Some young people would have stayed away from that. And of course, the police now being able to collect information to prove that there's criminal enterprise among the gangs, will be able to apprehend and incarcerate those who have chosen crime as a way of life. They know that those actions of the police and the security services will have a positive impact on the level of criminality and crime overall in Trinidad and Tobago. And that is the reason why they chose not to give the police that power, not to give the state that power last night, so that they can preserve the status quo, so that they could use it for political purposes. And the question we have to ask comes from a calypso: how many more must die? Because I'll tell you something, more people will die as a result of the action of the UNC this morning. We appeal to them. If what we do stops only one gang leader, saves only one life, saves only one child from getting involved in a gang activity, it would be worth it. They virtually told us to go to hell. But why are you surprised? Let me for a moment point out to Trinidad and Tobago that this morning's action does not stand alone. And those who are waiting to replace us as government on whichever day the election is called, they are known to us and they have a history. And this action with respect to treating with crime and criminality is not a unique development. Let me point out 15 developments to you involving Mrs. Kamla Persad-Bissessa's action and leadership and the UNC as government or opposition in Trinidad and Tobago. And then you'll understand why this morning should surprise no one. When Mrs. Kamla Persad-Bissessa came into office in 2010, Prime Minister with overwhelming support, she met a security intelligence agency, meaning a body of experts, trained specialists in the security services, whose job it was to find information about persons who were planning crime or carrying out criminal conduct. The Security Intelligence Agency, the SIA. One of the first things Mrs. Persad-Bissessa did as Prime Minister of Trinidad and Tobago was to get rid of the management and leadership of that agency and appointed someone called Reshmi Ramnarayan, a telephone operator, to that position. And to do so, and to justify it, lied to the population by way of a number of ministers in Parliament that Reshmi Ramnarayan had degrees and qualification and therefore should hold the job. When I, as opposition leader, broke this story and objected to this conduct, she accused me of racism because Reshmi was an Indian. She accused me of being anti-woman because Reshmi was a woman. And she accused me of being against youth because Reshmi was young. Remember that story? That is now part of our history. Patrick Manning, Prime Minister, dealing with the same problem because the criminality didn't start last week or last month. Gang activity and chronic criminality existed under the Manning regime. And Patrick Manning and his government put in place a special anti-crime unit to increase the policing in Trinidad and Tobago, because the police service was deemed to be not up to the task, largely because it was known that there was significant corruption in the police service that hindered intelligence gathering and required a special arrangement from special officers whose job it is to treat with what we are trying to treat with now. So there was sought the special anti-crime unit of Trinidad and Tobago, where there were specialist trained officers, specialist equipment, to focus on this problem. One of the first things Mrs. Prasad Bisesa did as Prime Minister of Trinidad and Tobago in the early months, in the early weeks of her tenure, was to shut down the special anti-crime unit and to summarily dismiss a large number of highly trained officers whose job was to protect the state and the citizens from the criminal element. Third item she did, as part of the information gathering establishment that she met in office, was the airship. Remember the blimp that flew quietly over our heads, but had telephony and digital capacity to monitor conversations between persons of interest to the state. Because communication and transport are the two things that criminals need if they're going to be functional. And collecting information on criminals by way of the cell phone traffic was part of the state's security arrangements. That blimp was bought for, I think, $14 million, some similar figure. They sold it for $50,000. Shut down that operation and dispensed with the equipment. Replaced it with nothing. Fourthly, there was the offshore patrol vessels, required for two purposes. One, to secure our borders from being penetrated by persons bringing to us undesirables, arms and ammunition. And also, we are having our tentacles way out into the Atlantic, requiring us to protect our oil and gas assets off the East Coast in the Atlantic Ocean, and requiring a certain quality of vessel that can get out there and stay out there on station for a period of time to protect us from the terrorists and those who will harm us. If our blood is at Petrotrin, our heart is out on the East Coast. And we had paid for offshore patrol vessels. The very first one was already available to come to us, and the second one was doing sea trials. Mrs. Prasad Bisesa, as head of the cabinet, cancelled those contracts and got Minister Sandy to come to the parliament and lie, saying that the vessels were underperforming, they were lemons, and we should not continue the contract, and we risk all kinds of legal liabilities. When Mrs. Prasad Bisesa, as head of the cabinet and her cabinet, cancelled that contract and took back the money, because they were already paid for. In walks the Brazilian government and didn't only buy the boats from there, and that saved us from the liabilities, because had somebody not come and buy the boats, we would have had liabilities for cancelling the contract. Like we have liabilities now for the steel mill, the smelter that they shut down. But the Brazilians came in and bought the lemons. And I presume that the Brazilians are now drinking serious lemon juice in Brazil. Because they didn't only buy the boats that we had ordered. They've ordered more of the same boats, and those boats are now known as the Trinidad class boats in the Brazilian Navy. But Mrs. Prasad Bisesa told this country that we didn't have to fight crime on the sea. So therefore, we didn't need OPVs. We have to fight crime on land in Trinidad and Tobago. So they canceled the contract, and of course, the criminals had a field day. And what we have seen since then is less MP3s and more AR-15s. Assault weapons in every community in Trinidad and Tobago today. And we don't make any of them here. They all come into us through our borders. And of course, while the cancellation of the OPVs took place, something else didn't take place. There were 4 helicopters, Augusta Westland helicopters, expensive helicopters because they were required to be on the OPVs and operate in the ocean. So you had to buy a particular kind of quality of helicopters for that because the Sea Blast and so on, a very strong and expensive one. 4 of them were coming with that. They didn't cancel that. They kept that at a cost of $2 billion, those 4 helicopters. And of course, one of them, which was assigned to the Special Forces, was converted into a luxury transport. Understand? For prime ministerial travel from south to north. Augusta Westland helicopter, and by its use by her, became known as the Wetland. Well, I'll tell you something. The maintenance of those helicopters that they kept was $15 million a month. And we did so for how many years? It came to this government when we are faced with a bill of $200 million a year to maintain them, much as we would have wanted to have them flying around here and there. We had to make a decision as to what do we do with $200 million. We grounded them for a while, and we've put them into a different arrangement so as not to be paying that kind of money. $15 million a month maintenance. That was kept. And of course, intelligence equipment. You were surprised at what happened this morning? Inexplicably. Ask them to explain this. At Piarco Airport, there was facial recognition technology, meaning as you come through the airport, your face becomes part of the security interest and is recorded. And you can be identified by facial features at Piarco Airport. They shut that down and stripped it out. And of course, the servers that were being used with the information gathering were also put in storage to rot. When you see them, you could ask them, what was the reason for that? Because to us, it is inexplicable that a government will do that, especially a government facing our terrorism type of problems that we have, and of course, our chronic crime problem in Trinidad and Tobago. And of course, there was a weekend, I think it was over a 4-day period, 11 persons were killed in the Arima area. And it was August 2011. Mrs. Prasad Bisesa declared a state of emergency. That was their crime plan to treat with this spike. I think it was last weekend. 16 people were killed over a 4-day period in this crusade of killings that take place from the criminal gang element in this country. I presume the advice they will give to us is to declare 2 states of emergency. Because if 11 gives you 1, 16 should give you 1 plus. But we have become so accustomed to the killings that 16 people have been killed in a similar period, and not even them could have mentioned a solution like a state of emergency. Because what happened then, we learned then that a state of emergency does not a solution bring to this problem. State of emergency wasn't only declared. You heard all the talk yesterday from them about people's rights and the abuse of people by the security services. What they were talking to you about is what happened under their action with a state of emergency. People's rights. An Attorney General under Mrs. Kamla Prasad Bisesa by the name of Anand Ramlugan declared that jail was made to ripe fig and watched. And the police are on affidavit. I have seen an affidavit by one of the police officers that said that they were instructed to lock up people and look for the evidence after. The end result is there are all kinds of liabilities for the state now, where there are people claiming compensation and receiving compensation because they were subjected to that kind of abuse. And where the government's lawyers have asked the 2 key people in the cabinet just to go on affidavit to say the reason why a state of emergency was declared. Mrs. Kamla Prasad Bisesa, as Prime Minister, and Mr. Anand Ramlogan, as Attorney General, are the two members of the cabinet who will be required to speak for the cabinet in these legal matters. Those who have sued the state for taxpayers' money, they are saying that there was no reason to have a state of emergency. They and the lawyers are saying that. The state's defense is, yes, there was a reason. And the government lawyers asked Ms. Kamla Prasad Bisesa and Mr. Anand Ramlogan to just go on affidavit as required by law and say and give the reason why the emergency was declared. Both of them have flatly refused to assist the state in these matters, knowing full well that by doing so, they hand these cases to the persons who have taken action against the state, against taxpayers, for actions that they took when they were in the cabinet. And I come now to Section 34. Section 34 was one of the most heinous conspiracies that ever took place in a Commonwealth government, in a Commonwealth Parliament. Need I remind you that there were people who were friends of the UNC government who were facing almost imminent extradition to courthouses abroad. And the Kamla Prasad Bisesa government under Mrs. Kamla Prasad Bisesa came to the parliament under the guise of bringing legislation to treat with the huge backlog of cases in the courts, knowing that if they do that, we, the opposition, will jump at agreeing to have that done. Because one of the things we distinguish ourselves in the opposition, is agreeing with the government on every single matter which we believe was in the public's interest. So they knew that if they brought a bill to say this bill is to have the effect of reducing the court's backlog, that they could count on the PNM support. And they got that support. But in the debate in the parliament, we got an assurance from them that they will not proclaim that law until certain things were done. And for the things to be done, you required at least 24 months, into 3 years, as a matter of fact. They were going to build some court complexes. They were going to appoint masters in the Supreme Court, and so on and so on. And they gave us the assurance, it's on the Hansard, that they will not proclaim the legislation until these things were in place. Guess what? Between the House and the Senate, somebody in Mrs. Prasad Bisesa's government inserted Section 34 into the law. Up to this day, we don't know who. And when they got to the upper house, that Section 34 was identified. And while we, on Independence Night, were watching fireworks, Mrs. Prasad Bisesa and her UNC government proclaimed not the law, they pulled out certain key clauses, Section 34, from the law and proclaimed it. It became law on Independence Night, unbeknownst to the country. I think it was 2 days later we discovered that this had happened. But the people who were going to benefit from it knew it had happened, even though it wasn't gazetted at that time. So Monday morning, they were in the court. This happened on a weekend. And Monday morning, those UNC people, financiers, who they were protecting, were in the court seeking to benefit from this secret proclamation of Section 34. That was the extent of the conspiracy of Section 34. Needless to say, that was under the guidance of Mrs. Kamla Prasad Bisesa. That was the leadership of Mrs. Kamla Prasad Bisesa. And the beneficiaries were not you or the children or the parents. The beneficiaries were persons who were already charged, who were in front of the court, who were facing extradition. And Mrs. Kamla Prasad Bisesa had no difficulty in putting that bill in place, bringing it to the parliament, executing it, creating the opportunity for the loophole for them to go to the court and argue for their freedom. But this morning, she had all kinds of difficulty in voting to make gang activity criminal in Trinidad and Tobago, because she's the great protector of people's rights and people's interests, and she was the great protector against abuse and parliamentary and cabinet overreach. Mrs. Kamla Prasad Bisesa should be the last person in this country who anybody should listen to, because this association with facilitating escape from the court is bolted to her bosom from that day and for all times. And of course, it didn't end there. The Solicitor General, Mrs. Honeywell Donaldson, saw significant and dangerous wrongdoing between the AG's office and private law offices and the prisons, the famous Prison Gate Inquiry, which involves the law office of Mr. Ramdeen, the AG office of Mr. Ram Logan, and others. A public servant, Mrs. Honeywell Donaldson, tried to get the Attorney General to respond to her concerns about the alleged criminality involving the prisons and prisoners, and taxpayers paying money to lawyers for prisoners' complaints. The AG under Mrs. Kamla Prasad Bisesa ignored Mrs. Honeywell Donaldson's concern. Mrs. Honeywell Donaldson did the unusual. She wrote to the Prime Minister, Kamla Prasad Bisesa, on this matter. Mrs. Bisesa, by that time, was senior counsel, and so was Mr. Anand Ram Logan. Here it is, public servant, Solicitor General, writing to the Prime Minister, pointing out serious alleged criminal conduct. In fact, criminal business. It wasn't a one-off instance. It was a business, an enterprise going on where they were extracting money from taxpayers under the guise of compensating prisoners. What did Mrs. Kamla Prasad Bisesa do? She did absolutely nothing in responding to the concerns of Mrs. Honeywell Donaldson, except to send the letter to Mr. Ram Logan for its dealings, to investigate himself. Of course, Mr. Ram Logan threw it in the dustbin or some similar action. Mrs. Donaldson, the consummate public servant that she was and so concerned that she was, she raised the matter a second time with the Prime Minister of Trinidad and Tobago, who was still Mrs. Kamla Prasad Bisesa. What did she do again? She sent the matter to Anand Ram Logan. At that stage, public servant Mrs. Honeywell Donaldson resigned from the public service. That is the history of Trinidad and Tobago under Mrs. Kamla Prasad Bisesa. Today, there are criminal investigations taking place into this matter. But of course, while the criminal investigations proceed, that is of no problem, no concern to Mrs. Kamla Prasad Bisesa. A little later on, a very prominent public servant, one called David West, who was head of the Police Complaints Authority. He wasn't at the time. At the time, he was head of the Central Authority. He had served as head of the Central Authority in the AG's office. Had reason to complain that the Attorney General in Trinidad and Tobago had taken certain kinds of actions with him that amounted, by way of his allegation, to witness tampering, attempting to pervert the course of justice. When that became public and came to the attention of the Prime Minister, Mrs. Kamla Prasad Bisesa, the first reaction was, where is the evidence? David West identified a member of Mrs. Prasad Bisesa's cabinet as a person who could corroborate this development, this information. That person was no less a person than the Minister of National Security, Mr. Gary Griffith. And all of this was taking place in the public domain. Mr. Gary Griffith confirmed that he had knowledge and information which seemed to support what Mr. David West was saying about the behavior of the Attorney General. How did Mrs. Prasad Bisesa treat with that? She fired Mr. Gary Griffith from the cabinet. Mr. Gary Griffith must be the only Commonwealth minister who was ever fired for telling the truth. And the only Prime Minister who have accomplished that distinction is Mrs. Kamla Prasad Bisesa. Live sport. Unbeknownst to the rest of the country, the cabinet that was led by Mrs. Kamla Prasad Bisesa did the most unusual thing. They decided to spend a number of millions of dollars, $8 million, for one season, over the August vacation, to create sporting activity for young people, to keep them out of trouble, and to use sport as a palliative, and to absorb their energies and so on. But interestingly enough, where that money was being spent was in an area and amongst people who had already organized themselves into gangs. Same kind of gangs that we try now, whose activities we're now trying to make illegal. Live sport provided them with their first payday, $8 million. And the information that we have in the government system is that much of that money immediately was used to buy arms and ammunition. And unbeknownst to the country, that $8 million, unbeknownst to those outside the cabinet, because those in the cabinet must have known, because they were the ones providing the money. And Mrs. Kamla Prasad Bisesa was the head of the cabinet, so she must know what they were doing. They spent up to $400 million in that enterprise. And all that came out of it was a proliferation of violent gangs across Trinidad. Some of those gangs members are behind bars for other kinds of activity that flows from that, including murder, right? But $400 million. And how we found out? It was when the permanent secretary in the Ministry of Finance wrote to the permanent secretary in the Ministry of Sport a very unusual letter pointing out the behavior of the permanent secretary in the Ministry of Sport in spending public money in the most cavalier and unaccountable ways. That was live sport, which continues as a saga in this country. And of course, the minister was protected by the Prime Minister at the time, Andy Roberts, but eventually Watermore and Flower and Mr. Roberts, kicking and screaming, was made to resign. And what did Ms. Kamla Prasad Bisesa do? The audit report of the Central Audit of the Ministry of Finance, which had a specific condition that it not be made public, because to make it public would be to jeopardize its efficacy in being used against persons who had questions to answer. Mrs. Prasad Bisesa, knowing that the report was not complete, came to the Parliament and publicized it. She is a senior counsel. I'm not even a fireside lawyer. And I know that once you do that, you give the defense a way out. And the question that has to be asked is, why did Mrs. Prasad Bisesa do that? But she did it. Arnold Roberts then, on that get-out-of-jail card, went to court and sued. And just as we expected, the court ruled that the state was wrong and the report was not to be made public because it was premature, the same way they're calling on us to do that same thing with other things. And Arnold Roberts won his case. The very day that Arnold Roberts got that judgment in his favor in the court, Mrs. Prasad Bisesa called a public meeting in Diego Martin, put Arnold Roberts on the platform, and offered him a senatorship. That is the kind of madness that exists in Trinidad and Tobago today. It was some significant pushback from within her ranks, surprisingly, that caused her not to carry out that promise. But Arnold Roberts was on his way back into the parliament. Because as far as she was concerned, the $400 million nice sport scandal, the people who were killed in their beds, the criminal gangs that proliferated across the country was of no concern to Mrs. Prasad Bisesa. All she was concerned about was getting Arnold Roberts back in the parliament. I tell you, these are not stories I make up. This is our history. And in recent times, this government that came into office, talking and pointing out the rape and the pillage that was taking place during Mrs. Kamla Bisesa Prasad's tenure, associated with certain public and private officials. In our short term in office, we took steps to pursue specific actions of corrupt practice requiring the attention of the court. One of the actions that we have advanced so far all the way to the court is the behavior of the HDC, which had Mr. Munilal as his line minister, and he was also line minister for EMBD, where hundreds of millions of dollars of taxpayers' money flowed through this company of no consequence. And we did the work like we did on this bill, prepared the cases, and went to court to complain about the behavior of contractors and public officials. And in the evidence that we have gathered, Mr. Munilal, Dr. Munilal, is implicated. And he's listed in the court documents as an individual who has questions to answer, a defendant, taken there by the state. And guess what? As far as Mr. Prasad Bisesa is concerned, Dr. Munilal is now her bosom buddy. Bosom buddy. And of course, another matter we took to the court from the HDC under the Munilal tenure was the purchase of a piece of land in Couva, which I first raised as opposition leader in the parliament, where the valuations are suspect, not only suspect, but shown to be. And we saw where taxpayers were ripped off to the tune of $120 million. And we identified the persons who have cases to answer. We found the person in the public sector who received the bribe from the person who paid it from the private sector. And all that evidence is in the court. But the person with the questions to answer in that, under Mrs. Prasad Bisesa's tenure, has now been elevated from private citizen to deputy political leader of the UNC, who call themselves party in waiting. So all these people are in waiting to come into government, because if this period of difficulty for the country, be it economic, be it crime-ridden, whatever it is, if that overcomes the psyche of the average person in this country, the intention is that you will move the PNM out of office, and they will move into office. And you know who you'll get in office? You'll get a return of Mrs. Kamla Prasad Bisesa to continue what I've just outlined to you there. You will get Anand Ramlogan, who is in the police hand now, who she praises as the greatest Attorney General ever. You will get Gerald Ramdeen, who is laser-like being looked at by the police, and who the court just ruled and told him that dead men don't only tell no tales, but they can't fight no case. You'll get him. And of course, you will get Munilal and Jolene John. Those are the people. It is in their interests, their hope, their expectation, their ambition that caused Mrs. Kamla Prasad Bisesa this morning to vote the way they voted, to bully her team to vote against this bill to make sure that gang activity remain a criminal act, a non-criminal act in Trinidad and Tobago. So it is not a crime to organize a gang. It's not a crime to recruit into a gang. It's not a crime to use your gang activity to buy and propagate the use of heavy weapons in this country, firearms in every street, in every home. And of course, to use your power in the street and your money in the street to terrorize mothers to hand over their daughters. That is happening in Trinidad and Tobago today. But let me end on this note. The most cynical part of it is this. I didn't believe it when I heard it, but I believed it this morning when the votes were cast. It is the UNC's strategy as discussed and agreed to that the crime and criminality of gang activity is largely in PNM constituencies, and therefore it ought to be left to fester like a cancer and overcome the PNM. And their constituencies are largely safe from it, and therefore they have no interest in its abatement. I didn't believe it when I heard it, but I believe it now because I've seen it. If you look at where this problem started, where it largely exists, it started as an urban area problem among inner city urban youth. Port of Spain was largely Laventil. One time, not too long ago, it was a Laventil thing. Today it's Laventil. It's Port of Spain. It's Diego Martin. It's Tunapuna. It's Sangre Grande. It's San Fernando. And they see that as those are PNM areas. And of course, they have no real interest in crime abatement in those areas. Their only interest is to sing hallelujah every morning you wake up. And those who can't go to the police station to use the police as their law enforcement agency and have their own law enforcement in the street. You shoot my brother, I shoot your sister. You kill my dog, I kill your dog. I've not said kill your cat, I said kill your dog. No, that is what is going on. Retribution, vengeance killing. I can't get the son, I kill the father. Can't get the brother, I kill the other brother. That is what is making up the numbers of criminals in this country and the numbers of dead bodies. And this political party that is only hell-bent on getting into office with that team of people I just mentioned for that and other purposes. They have one other purpose. They want to get back into office, to use the government to protect themselves. We have gone to Parliament and made the case that preliminary inquiry should be abolished because it is virtually trying a case before you try a case and working for those who have questions to answer and deep pockets where they could carry a preliminary inquiry for 15 years and not be made to answer for the charge that they have on them. That's going on right now. And when we came to the Parliament, even though there was agreement among us that preliminary inquiry should be a thing of the past, and that people get their protection from the DPP, who can intervene and take action if you are being taken to trial without evidence. It's happening in this court. So there's no need for that first trial. But what they are seeing, half of them expect to be before the court, and they want to use the preliminary inquiry as their way out, because the mountain of evidence is insurmountable. That is what is passing for legislation in Trinidad and Tobago. That's the motivation for legislation. Don't pass it into law because I might need it to get out of jail. We can do no more. This is worse than Section 34. Section 34 was an abomination, but it only affected a small group of people who would have been taken to a court abroad and might have been incarcerated. It hurt us, it stained us, but it was affecting a small group of people. This act this morning, this cynical act this morning of voting without rhyme or reason except the ones I've just described, affects the life and the livelihood of every citizen in Trinidad and Tobago. All I could say is that the PNM has done its part. And as it has been said in the Bible, as for me and my family, me and my household, we will serve the Lord. Thank you very much.